And I propose we start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Water Institute WaterTalk of the new term. I hope you enjoyed our 3-day research conference 2 weeks ago, where we explored achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in a post-COVID world across all 5 continents. My name is Roy Brouwer. I'm the Executive Director of the Water Institute, and I'm joining you here today from my home, like many of you. I want to start by acknowledging that we are participating today from traditional territories of the first people across the country. And here in the Waterloo region, I acknowledge that I'm on the Haldeman Tract, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River. The Haldeman Tract is within the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I would like to encourage you to take a moment to recognize the traditional land where you are. Today's Water Talk will be introduced by Professor Philippe van Capellen, followed by a moderated panel discussion with the help of my Water Institute colleague Nancy Goucher. And before I introduce today's moderator, just a few housekeeping items. Please add your questions to the Q&A box, not the chat box. You can do this at any time throughout the talk, and Nancy and Philippe will then get to your questions after the Water Talk. And only use the chat box for general comments or technical issues. This webinar will be recorded and posted to the Water Institute YouTube channel afterwards. At this point, I will introduce your moderator for the day, Professor Philippe van Capellen. Philippe is the Canada Excellence Research Chair Laureate in Ecohydrology and head of the Ecohydrology Group in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. Philippe, thank you very much for moderating today's Water Talk. I'm happy to hand over to you.
Thank you, Roy, and good morning to everyone. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's Water Talk speaker, Rebecca Tharme. To give you a little bit of her background, Dr. Rebecca Tharme is currently a fellow in residence at le STUDIUM, Loire Valley Institute for Advanced Studies, as well as the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique of CNRS in the Cité, Territoire, Environnement et Société group at the University of Tours in France. At the CNRS, Rebecca is assessing environmental water management and biocultural diversity with support from the EU Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program and a Marie Curie grant agreement. As an independent principal of River Futures and through her former roles at the Nature Conservancy and the International Water Management Institute, Dr. Tharme has gained over 25 years of experience collaborating with diverse partners from government agencies to research institutes on interdisciplinary solutions to challenges in the sustainable management of natural resources. Rebecca serves on the IUCN Species Survival Commission's Freshwater Conservation Committee. She's also an adjunct principal research fellow at the Australian River Institute and serves as an associate editor for Frontiers in Environmental Science. Dr. Tharme holds a PhD in zoology, specializing in aquatic ecology. Today's talk of Dr. Tharme is entitled Riverscapes and Lifeways, Biocultural Diversity and River Flow Management. And with this, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Tharme.
Thank you very much. I hope you're hearing me well. And it's a great pleasure to be here virtually today with you for this virtual Water Talk. And thank you for such a warm introduction. I'm in the fortunate position of being a fellow at the Le STUDIUM Loire Valley Institute. And during my time as a fellow, I've been able to explore an area that interests me greatly around the cultural and social aspects of rivers and how those connect to river flow management and how we might improve and strengthen our ability to manage river flows by including more explicitly these aspects in riverscape management. So I'll firstly, I have already a problem with sharing my screen. Hang on a second. To have lost the connection. I hope you're hearing me fine. I'll just try again. Are you seeing my screen now if I move on this way?
I can see the screen and I can hear you.
I've lost my ability to use my mouse, but I'll use the digital way of forwarding the slides. So firstly, just to acknowledge that not only the people that are supporting me being here in France, but more broadly the collaborators that have actually allowed me to explore this topic and with whom I've been working over a number of years, particularly in the area of environmental water management. So I've learned a lot from that knowledge exchange, and I'm still learning a great deal around sociocultural aspects. So I hope you'll bear with me, because this is not my technical background, but the interdisciplinary nature of the work is very rewarding and very enriching, and I hope you'll find some of it interesting today. So when we think about biological diversity, we're thinking about the living systems in rivers. Particularly, we will be thinking about the genetics of species. We're thinking about populations, habitats, and ecosystems and their processes. And when we're thinking about cultural diversity, we'll be thinking about things like the mind views, the world views, the cosmologies of people, their relationships with the natural world, their language and linguistic diversity, the ways in which they see, know and experience and interact with the world around them. And I like this definition. There are myriad definitions out there, but we can think about biocultural diversity as the diversity of all life, both human and other forms of life, and in which that life and that diversity is highly interrelated and in many ways has co-evolved over time within a complex socioecological system. And rivers are indeed very complex socioecological systems. And if we think about the riverscape and how this diversity has evolved over time, one of the major ways in which this has happened is through pulsing flow regimes. The nature of flow in the landscape has helped rivers to create, select, and disperse both biological and cultural diversity. And particularly in relation to low or dry season parts of the year and high flow and wetter parts of the year, those changes in the dynamics of the hydrology underpin the dynamics of habitat, the availability of resources to people, and therefore their resource use strategies and risk avoidance strategies. And those strategies used by people are also akin to some of the strategies that biodiversity uses, different plants and animals of rivers. And this complex history of human interaction, knowledge, values, and stewardship of the environment and the role of water in sustaining life is really what makes rivers particularly special when we think about biocultural diversity. And of course, there's a long history of that with ancient civilizations, many of them arising around rivers, many rivers being roads, liquid roads for the transport of people and the communication of people and the movements of empires into different parts of the world. So we can see that flows and river hydrology have a role to play in both aspects of diversity and bring them together very strongly. Riverscapes, we know, are ecosystems that are very precious in terms of their biodiversity and the natural capital that this represents for society. Wonderfully precious systems. And they're also highly valued in terms of the cultural diversity and heritage. And here I've just drawn a few examples from diverse sources in terms of things such as artistic expression, built heritage, interrelationship between built heritage and river systems, the history of civilizations around rivers. There are many ways in which we can represent built and the more tangible aspects of cultural heritage, and also some of the less tangible aspects. And so it's just also a very rich area in terms of diversity and the heritage that represents. We know for river systems particularly, there are multiple demands placed on them by society as well for human security, with water, food, and energy security. And the flow regime, in terms of the low flows, high flows, and flood events, is really one of the major variables that drives the connections between habitat, water quality, connectivity, biotic interactions, energy supplies, and the integrity or health of these ecosystems in terms of the services they provide to people and to the different sectors that place water demands on rivers. And of course, through this primary driver of ecosystem change is really without doubt hydrological alteration. There's a lot of evidence to show that hydrologic infrastructure, water management infrastructure, whether it's physical barriers or the operation of dams that alter pattern and timing of different flow events, or it's lost connectivity with floodplains, or it's land use and climate change, all of these factors are altering very significantly river health and the ability for rivers to support the social and cultural needs of people. And we know we're in a situation now where many rivers are already in the red through unsustainable water abstraction. It impacts on flow regimes, the timing and pattern of flows, and changes to climate. And we can see major losses in the connectivity of rivers, disrupted movement, not only of the water itself, but also of the sediments, the nutrients, and the species themselves. We've got disconnected floodplains, we're seeing deltas shrinking, and we're in a position now where only some 37% of rivers are actually, of the larger rivers particularly, are free flowing, and even fewer of them reach the sea, the coast in that condition. Most of those systems that are long and still in quite good condition in terms of their connectivity and flow regulation state tend to be in the less accessible areas for people to tap into in terms of fresh water. But they also are, if you look at the map in terms of places like the Congo and the Amazon, some of the places that are facing enormous future pressures from infrastructure development. So we're really facing a global crisis, both in terms of biological diversity and cultural diversity. A few weeks ago, WWF and partners put out the Freshwater Living Planet Index, the report on that, and it showed that we're still facing decline. We're incrementally still having a serious decline in freshwater populations. Across many different populations of species, we've seen an 84% decline since 1970. And interestingly, if we look at linguistic diversity as an indicator for culture, we see in the same time period a decline in linguistic diversity, with now something in the order of 3,000 languages endangered. It's quite hard to find other metrics of declines in cultural diversity, so I would love to hear if anyone has other suggestions on what those might be, but certainly the pattern is the same. And whatever we look at in terms of the impacts on ecosystem services for people, if we look at impacts of flow alteration on directly dependent downstream rural communities, or we look at the economic implications of natural capital degradation, or we look at the declines in different categories of nature's contributions to society, all of these measures show serious impacts for societal well-being. And so one of the more pleasurable things that we were able to do during lockdown was I worked with a cartoonist in Finland who I had not met before, to actually draw up a cartoon that really hopefully in some way represents this crisis moment and the need to bring living waters back to our planet. And this is 2020 is a year for profound change in terms of how we approach conservation of biological diversity and culture. And one of the tools that definitely we feel has a role to play in helping redress this decline in freshwater biodiversity and in cultural diversity is the tool of environmental flows, which is an integrated part of environmental water management. And this is just one definition. Different countries have their own ways of thinking. With environmental flows, we're really looking at the quantity, the timing, and also the quality of freshwater flows and water levels that are needed to sustain aquatic ecosystems. And for much of the history of environmental water management, this has been a stronger focus. But we also recognize that these flows are supporting human cultures, economies, livelihoods, and well-being. And so we're now finding that in order to really be more effective in implementing environmental flows in rivers and other wetlands, we need to be paying more attention to the second part of this definition, to that interconnection between the ecosystem and society. And in order to do that, we really have to be looking at rivers, which is what I'm focusing on in my fellowship here. And we have to be looking at rivers through the lens of values, because allocating water to the environment and to other users is a values-based decision to share water within a complex system where there will always be costs and benefits for different groups of people, and make no mistake, also for the environment. And so we have to really think about the economic, social, and cultural values, the environmental ones as well, of course, and also things like the governance values. And this is really a fundamental part of the process that's been neglected, but it's really increasing in profile as we look at value and at valuing water more effectively and appropriately in the future. There's been increasing attention over the last few years, particularly on understanding the social-cultural relations that are critical to advance environmental water management. we've started to pay more attention, I feel, in this field to the vital roles that river flows play in supporting human societies, but also in terms of the full and equal participation of cultures, respect for their rights, their responsibilities, and their governance systems. And I think we're in a moment now in the history of environmental water management where environmental flow practitioners are beginning to more appropriately acknowledge the embedded and reciprocal and constitutive relationships that people have with rivers and the diversity of ways in which we can know and relate to and utilize these systems. So it's a really interesting time for environmental flow sciences and practice as well for that reason. And I want to really talk a little bit now about some cases from environmental flow practice that really focus our attention more on this idea of living in the rhythm of the waters. It's an idea that my host here, who's the UNESCO co-chair of river culture, it's an idea that he put forward a few years ago. And I think we can learn a lot from these cases of environmental flows where we actually build. If you look at the right, there's some examples for different rivers in the world. We start to build these recommended flow regimes to maintain the ecosystem and also the people that are depending on these systems in various ways. So I just want to talk through a few examples of these cases. I'm not deeply familiar with all of them, but for me, they were ones that resonated as they show different aspects of these social cultural connections that I think are interesting. And I think we're early in our efforts to explore them and to share the knowledge and learn from some of these experiences that we've had over the last years, particularly in the last decade, I would say. And I'll start with one I know that I'm sure is more familiar to many of you on this call than it is to me, and that is the Columbia River Basin, the transboundary basin. And for me, what was interesting a few years ago was seeing this map on the right related to the Columbia River Treaty. I guess I'd always known that salmoniid fisheries were very, very valued for the economies and the livelihoods of cultures of the tribal and First Nations and had been for many, many generations. But it was interesting to hear more about the Columbia River Treaty, and that in the early stage of the Columbia River Treaty, there was no consultation with the tribes and First Nations, and there was no consultation around fish and wildlife. And it was only a decade ago that 15 tribes on the US side, and I'm interested to hear more about what happened on the Canadian side of the border, but 15 tribes reached a unified position on this treaty in terms of the rights to take fish at all the usual and accustomed places. And this map was drawn up, which shows all those places in the basin and the relationships with the places where water infrastructure is present or planned, and where that is potentially already affecting the ability for people to interact in the ways that they're culturally adapted to do in the longer term. And through that unified position, the treaty was modified. The environmental flow regimes for the dams in this basin were modified to better support social cultural needs of people. And ecosystem function became a co-equal function with hydropower and with flood control. And an integrated plan for one of the sub-basins, and maybe now for others, I hope as well, the Yakima Basin Water Plan was developed by that First Nation with Washington State and water users. So there was really a very much more appropriate and participatory way of drawing up and agreeing to the next stages of this treaty. In Australia, there are many, many great examples. I just wanted to highlight one that I find interesting in terms of the use of Indigenous knowledge in environmental water management in Northern Australia, which is an area of the country that houses 50% of the country's water. And in this part of the basin, the Daly River communities, Aboriginal communities, have their own Aboriginal water calendar with 11 different seasons that are connected in various ways to flows in the river. And they use this calendar to inform them on management decisions that they need to take in terms of resource use and access at different times of the year. And this information, this knowledge has also helped in redesigning the flow ecology relationships to include these flow production services and relationships that people have with their river. For example, in the past, environmental flow assessment focused on a species of turtle, pig-nosed turtle, was important for conservation, but neglected to include the long-necked turtle. And if you can see in the graph here, that turtle is common, but it is the most valued food source for this particular community. So environmental flow procedures were modified to account for that. In Tanzania, in the Rufiji Basin, an assessment was made, an environmental flow assessment was made for the Kilombero River floodplain. And this was focused on flow events to secure not only basic human needs, but also the needs of the environment, which is a right by law under the Tanzanian policy on water. And what was interesting was the very strong dependencies people had in these areas with the river and with the flood pulsing nature of that river. And if you look, you can see that crop farming, fishing, livestock keeping all had strong flow dependencies on the river. And this kind of information has helped informed decision-making in Tanzania and in the Rufiji Basin, which is the largest basin of this country in East Africa, informed decision-making on where to focus attention on flow protection and where to focus attention on flow restoration. So in the Great Ruaha National Park, for example, flow restoration is aimed at bringing back water to support the wildlife inside the park. Whereas in the Kilombero, flow protection is aimed at supporting and maintaining the flood dependencies that people have with this river system, as well as wetlands of international importance. In the Ganges River system in India, there's been a lot of very interesting and elegant work to look at the spiritual and livelihoods connections of people with the river system. Millions of people, of course, consider this Mother River of India to be sacred, and bathing in its waters washes away the sins of people. So there are many rituals, daily rituals, and larger ceremonies around this river. And environmental flow assessments have really made an effort to include these livelihoods and spiritual water needs. Including using, for example, built infrastructure such as the ghats along the river as a reference for historical flow conditions, and in terms of motivating for flows for religious purposes. And including the Kumbh festivals. Now the Kumbh festivals, some of the largest gatherings of people in the world for religious purposes and spiritual purposes. And the Kumbh Mela, where 120 million people bathe in the waters of the Ganges, that's on the representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. So there are very clear connections in a system like this between biodiversity and cultural diversity, and ways to manage that using environmental flow management. In the case of New Zealand, again, the relationships people have with rivers is very deep one, and it's been very influential in how we think about environmental flow setting in these kinds of contexts. But I think we still have a lot to learn from these kinds of case studies. For example, with the Maori people of New Zealand, there is an interconnectedness between humans and the environment that lies at the center of their worldviews. Going into an environmental flow assessment without understanding that there is no differentiation of the spiritual health and the ecological health of the river system and the water resources makes it very challenging, and it's not a way to really move forward environmental management in a place where there is this place-based sacred context. And some of the water sources in this country are sacred as well. And there's some examples here of the relationships between different groups of Maori people and the river that I think really articulates this interconnectedness. And there is no way in which cultural and biological diversity can be treated independently in doing assessments of environmental water needs in a place like this. And it's interesting that the Wanganui and many other rivers now in the world are gaining legal status of legal persons. So really altering quite fundamentally how we view river management in these contexts. Interestingly, in environmental flow assessments with Maori people in New Zealand, the Maori have informed flow setting through their cultural preferences and using their own knowledge. And they've used this knowledge to set flows for foods, for materials, for fresh water, but also for their sense of well-being and for cultural landscapes. And this has been directly complemented by ecological studies done as part of an integrated team of people. And that's led to allocations for the environment for cultural purposes, which are in the statutory plans for the management of these river basins for more than 45 rivers in New Zealand, and with a high reliability or assurance of supply. But what's probably at the moment most challenging is really how to address some of the intangible cultural heritage and the intangible relationships that people have with rivers, and when in the process of environmental flow setting that's most appropriate to do. And this is an example from the Andean Amazon rivers of the Shawi, from the Shawi people who have long-standing relationships with rivers in their territories. They believe that they can connect with their ancestors this way. That's part of their belief system. And every day they have rituals with the river that allow them, where they tap the surface of the water, and that allows them to gain the energy they need for their daily activities, and also to connect directly with their ancestors, which is fundamental to their way of life. The challenge is how really to incorporate these kinds of relationships in these processes. And I think we've only really just started to even understand what some of these relationships are. So through my fellowship, I've really wanted to look at how we might actually go the river basin case to the global scale. And really wanted to talk a little bit, if there's time, and please let me know if that's not the case, about some of the ways in which we've been thinking about doing this. And this is really early thinking. But we want to really undertake a situation assessment now, and we started to do it, of biocultural diversity and flows, where we can leverage existing knowledge and data, and where we can start to highlight the likelihood and the degree to which we are at risk of losing, continuing to lose biocultural and diversity in relation to current and future flow regulation and fragmentation of rivers. And there are a number of examples here I've shown of existing data sets that we can think of using and exploring, and particularly to look at what are those rivers in the world that are not only free flowing, but also in other ways of exceptional cultural diversity. And I've been putting together some of those data sets that are available online, for example, the World Database of Protected Areas, and there are other databases more difficult to get access to, but it's possible. I'm in the stage of hoping to get information on Indigenous peoples and community conserved territories and areas. There are also many sites that are multi-internationally designated areas. Some of the World Heritage sites and biosphere reserves and the Ramsar sites, Ramsar wetland sites. And so we're starting to explore the criteria, the social and cultural criteria for the designation of those sites, and how we might be able to use that more effectively, that information more effectively. The free-flowing rivers analyses that I showed earlier, and really draws on some very nice work done by McGill University and others in Australia and elsewhere, to set up as a global hydrographic database, as it were, with a set of very different variables, from hydrology through to geology, land cover, and land use. So we have a very nice hierarchical, spatially nested set of information that we can use on the biophysical side and the hydrological side to do this kind of analysis. At the moment, there are 56 different variables in that data set, but none of them are directly around culture. Obviously, things like demography are included, but really the challenge now is what are the cultural indicators and metrics that we can bring in. Seeing a message in the chat here. Okay, thank you. Maybe let me know if I have a few more minutes on my end. I'll carry on until you tell me otherwise. Yeah, so we're looking now at these cultural measures. For example, we know there's a global database on ethno-linguistic groups and the population sizes of those groups globally. How might we be able to use that information with this kind of analysis? And we've been thinking about a number of ways to do this, myself and colleagues, and this is a very open exploratory study that we're doing at the moment. For example, river-dependent food production systems that link to flood pulse and flood recession agriculture, obviously one key area. And here I've just mapped shown a map for the major farming systems of sub-Saharan Africa. We know that that links to livestock farming, crops, and fisheries. And it looks as though at the moment for data, we might be in a good position fairly soon in terms of looking at inland small-scale capture fisheries, which, although a very small percentage, about 1%, I think, of the total global fisheries, are actually just, more than providing a significant, more than half the fisheries value to people in the developing world, and a major source of nutrition. 99 to 95% of that is actually reaching rural people who are poor and needing that for part of their nutrition and daily subsistence. So it's a very important part of the livelihoods connections to rivers and river biodiversity. And there's a study that's coming to a close at the moment, which will allow us hopefully to move from just estimated inland fishery catch to more explicit metrics on the sociocultural side. We're also looking at culturally important species in terms of global freshwater megafauna, and how we might be able to use some very nice global analyses that have been done on freshwater megafauna in terms of the cultural connections those species have. We think it might be an interesting group, and I've started some research with IGB in Germany on this, because culturally important species are recognized as influencing the cultural identity of a group of people by their role in subsistence or spirituality or indigenous economies. Many of these species are the larger bodied species, 30 kilograms and above. And these species are more vulnerable to threats such as flow alteration, and they live very long times, multi-generational times that relate very well to the intergenerational times of societies. And so we think that they may be a very good source of information, and we may be able to really make some interesting connections to social and cultural links to particular species. And of course, they occur in many of the river basins of the world, including those that are facing the highest challenges in terms of planned water infrastructure development. And so just here to illustrate, there have been some studies done, for example, on Murray cod and other large migratory fishes in terms of their role as cultural totems in the belief systems of people. Just a quick scan of the literature on crocodilians has shown their roles in mythology, belief systems, food, traditional medicine, and so on. And there are, of course, a large number, more than 200 megafauna that more than likely all have these kinds of connections socioculturally that have been underexplored to date. And so we'll see where that goes, but that's a promising, a very interesting area that we've started to work on. And I'd love to hear of any examples the people on this call have around this, this particular part of the project work. I'd like to end with just saying that it's a very active frontier now. Biocultural diversity and water management is really taking center stage in a number of global initiatives. And I can talk more about this during the discussion time, but I think I'd like to wrap up now. But just to say, there's an emergency recovery plan out there for freshwater biodiversity. Environmental flows is a key action item in that recovery plan. Next week, a number of us will be convening with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations to talk about how to integrate environmental flows more explicitly into the Sustainable Development Goals. At the moment, the only place where environmental flows sits in the Sustainable Development Goals is under the water stress indicator. So really, how can we make most effective use of that and support the countries in their environmental flow processes? And there's a lot of exchange and networking now at the moment on freshwater and nature culture interlinkages. Just yesterday, I was on a very interesting webinar hearing about a new water and heritage initiative. I'll leave it there, but hopefully we can talk more about some of the initiatives that people are familiar with during the discussion. So thanks very much for your time. I hope that the internet connection, which seemed to be lost on my side a few times, didn't end with
thank you so much, Rebecca, for this very thought-provoking and insightful presentation. I think the internet connection went quite well, and we already have a few questions from the audience. But thanks again. I think this was very much in the spirit of the WaterTalks to kind of look at interdisciplinarity, big issues related to water. So we have a few questions. I also have my own questions. But let's take, for instance, the question from one of our attendees. who states your current work is inherently inter or transdisciplinary. From your experience, where is interdisciplinarity most effectively applied? In research environments or by practitioners in applied situations? Do you have any tips or reflections on how to do interdisciplinarity?
Well, I think my first reaction is interdisciplinarity is really important, whether you're working in the policy realm, in the science and research, or in the application of that science in terms of sustainable development agenda. I think for me, for example, in my experience, the best way to really engage in an interdisciplinary way is to approach fundamentally any research, if it's in the research world, to fundamentally approach it from the perspective of all disciplines and stakeholders and actors that may have a role to play, an interest and a contribution to make. I think we're really in a phase now where co-design, co-development of research agendas is critically important. It's essential. I think doing research without that understanding of the other disciplines that are engaged or should be engaged with is really problematic. In my experience, my career started in South Africa during the reform of the Water Act. The country, changed its constitution, threw out the water law and started again. And so from the very beginning, research had to be applied. It had to be policy relevant. It had to bridge policy science, and it had to be practical on the ground. And there's no way that any one discipline can actually address managing water resources in a sustainable way to meet all the different demands placed on the resource, to meet the environmental needs, to meet the energy sector's demands, to address food security and agriculture without really bringing in all those disciplines. Environmental flows is a great field for that, though. It makes it very easy in a way because you really can't answer the question without having all those disciplines there. And you get a much richer and better informed and more implementable decision by doing that. So my advice is really to always think about the enablers that are going to make it possible for, if you're in science, to make your science relevant and applicable on the ground, so that it's really, really implementable and can be used by society. And I started with eco-hydrological science and taught myself did a course in hydrology and learned about hydraulics the hard way, and now I'm engaging. Got some funding to bring together social scientists and eco-hydrologists, brought together a group where half the room was social scientists, half the room were eco-hydrologists, and we put ourselves in the same room and with a structured agenda, not too structured, and had a dialogue around how we could do a better job of environmental flow management, bringing in the experience from the social sciences. So I think there are many different ways one can go about it, but the sooner you start to do it in whatever sphere you work in, I think the more enriched and implementable and relevant in your work is likely to be.
Yeah, well, that echoes a lot of the discussions that are ongoing here in the Water Institute. And maybe, Nancy, you want to add some comments to that, because you're our knowledge mobilization specialist here at the Water Institute.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is something that the Water Institute has prioritized in terms of trying to provide capacity to our researchers to find opportunities to have impact. And part of that is about ongoing relationship building with what in the knowledge mobilization community we call end users, but all sorts of stakeholders and people who are interested and practitioners of water management. And so, building ongoing continuous relationships where there's dialogue between researchers and those who are on the ground practicing these things, and making sure that the research questions are also posed in the way that makes sense to people, so that the results and can be disseminated in a way that can be practical.
Yes, definitely that building of trust and nurturing of relationships is it's just not enough attention given to that. And it takes time. It takes a considerable amount of time. It takes a sustained process of engagement and respect for different viewpoints. And those aspects, those enabling conditions, those are fundamental aspects that we tend to forget about. They're things to think about later as we rush in science, certainly to do the technical part of the work. But really for environmental flows, it's a science-informed social process, not the other way around. And so without those relationships, and from the very beginning, not partway through or at the very end, informing, sharing your knowledge with the people that might be using it, but being part of that process is the whole way through is very important. The challenge then is to be very careful, is to be informed and aware enough to be careful to know what's important in terms of, for example, the decision context. What are the power asymmetries among the different groups of people with whom you're engaging? What is the national policy context or the basin management agenda? What is the vision for the basin? Coming in to do a piece of work without even some sense of that it hampers your ability to make a difference. So, but yes, the relationship building is such an important part of that.
All right, so we have another question here, actually a couple of questions. So one is traditional water resources management has been focused on development. In other words, engineering river flows to support economic as opposed to biocultural development. And so in poor countries, this work has often been financed by multilateral development banks with the support of the local elites. So how do you see e-flow experts better influence technocrats and politicians?
Thanks. I knew there would be a tough question. Well, I think I think the best way we can influence it is to really be part of these interdisciplinary processes, working with those people all the time from the very beginning, sitting in the same, finding ways to engage, be in the same room with politicians. There are ways to, even simply summarizing our knowledge and sharing it in forms that can be used by people who are decision makers, helping support the capacity development of ourselves in informing ourselves more, but also actually the capacity development of those groups of people, and working more. It's hard. It's sometimes easier to shy away from working with the most challenging development agencies or working with, as was the person worded, the elites on the ground. But actually, it's hard, but it has to be done, because all values and all viewpoints have a role to play and need to be part of the discussion. So engaging from the beginning rather than shying away from those kinds of challenges is important. Next year we have a training course at IHE in the Netherlands around training on environmental flows for water managers, decision makers, to really help with implementation, because this history of development without considering these other views has really hampered implementation. So how do we both understand what are those perspectives from the political agenda, the side of politics, or the local on-ground communities? How do we understand those better, those viewpoints, and how do we navigate that terrain in a different way? And I think environmental flows is now in a phase where it's really trying to learn from what's not been done well and how it could do better through some of the case studies that are highlighted, to try and do a better job.
From maybe a practical viewpoint, I mean, of course, watersheds can be of any size. You have small watersheds, medium watersheds, huge watersheds. You mentioned, for instance, the example of the Ganges and also the Amazon River. And so if you start looking at that type of really, really big watersheds, of course, the number of stakeholders will increase a lot. Both the biocultural, or the biodiversity, and the cultural functions and attributes will, of course, increase kind of exponentially. So do you also see that there may be that applying e-flows, applying kind of this integrated multi-stakeholder approach is possible at certain scales of watersheds, but maybe not at other ones? Or where is it where can we achieve the highest effect, basically?
I think yes, I think it depends. I think it can be achieved at all scales. It's just the process might look a bit different, and the stakeholders, the key stakeholders will be different, and the process, the methodological part of the process will have to differ. But I think it can be done at any of those scales, and whether it's scaling up from the site-based individual dam project and the key stakeholders that are engaged in that process, or it's working at setting precautionary environmental flow estimates for a very large basin. The Rufiji Basin is 200,000 square kilometers of basin. It's massive. And so I think it can be done at all those levels. I think it's interesting and it's important to think about those scales. For example, in the case of the Rufiji, there was an assessment, a stakeholder-based assessment of what were the priorities for the key stakeholders at the scale of the Rufiji. And biodiversity conservation was actually a very high priority for those stakeholders. When the analysis was done at the finer scale of the smaller sub-basins, where there were more closer links to the rural communities, the priority was subsistence livelihoods. Those examples I showed you, their day-to-day subsistence, and so it's important to understand that. But it's also, I think, important to understand how that local level rolls up into the whole basin, the vision and mission for the whole basin, and the mandates that the management agencies have at these different scales.
Thank you.
Okay, I have another question. Has to do with frameworks to help us make decisions and pull together some of these different types of knowledge. So how do we compare different types of socio-cultural and socioeconomic values into a cost-benefit analysis framework? Do you have experience putting different types of values together in one unifying framework? And maybe I might also add on a question. Someone was wondering about the integrated water resources management framework and whether or not you see that as legitimate for river or watershed management. And, does it actually properly include biocultural aspects appropriately?
It's quite a dense question. If I don't answer all of it, do point me to the part I didn't answer well. But I think cost-benefit analyses, frameworks that really deal with different kinds of values in a unifying way. I think we're in the very early stages of being able to do that for rivers and river management, and which is the area that really I focus around. And I think it's hard, but we have to do it, and we are trying to do it. This question reminds me of work we did with the Federal Commission of Electricity in Mexico, where we looked at dam planning for one of the larger basins, the Coatzacoalcos Basin. 30 dams were planned for hydropower. And we looked at how to really analyze the social cultural aspects, not only the technical in terms of the megawatt production and the economic aspects. And there were no indicators that had been developed, but in this case, it's a great example of where you use existing knowledge of people in the room, because there were 2 anthropologists who worked with the Federal Commission of Electricity. And we were able to draw that framework together. And there's no one framework. I think it's very important to actually understand what are the frameworks that the agencies that manage are mandated to manage the resources. What are they using? What isn't in their existing frameworks, and how can their knowledge be used to inform that? So that was an example where we were able to bring them into a unified framework, but building on what was already there. And I think that's something, there's no one way to do this, and we really have to start with what's there and make the best of it. I think for trade-offs and decision-making around environmental water, there are some examples now. For example, one of the first ones was in the Mekong, looking at fish and energy production output and trying to put those on, in terms of where there might be gains to be made in terms of managing more for fisheries production, less for hydropower, optimizing these kinds of multi-criteria decision frameworks. I think there's a lot of research being done. It's a very active field right now. It's very interesting. It gets harder with the less tangible cultural connections. And I'm struggling, for example, to find what kinds of indicators are appropriate to use and can do the job well. And so I think there's a whole conversation around that's still in its very early stages. The validity of integrated water resources management framing, well, from my perspective, whether you call it river basin management, integrated water resources management, whether you use there are opportunities in there for environmental water management. There's a place for that as a part of that puzzle, as it were, of approaches. It's one approach within that kind of framing. I think the social cultural aspects definitely need more development there, and and environmental flows, we are really working on that. But of course, there is this wider, that wider framework. I think what has happened recently, the integration of human rights, the framework for human rights within with the IWRM framework, that those two have come together over the last, I think, year or so in a different way. I think that will spur quite a different framing that will resonate better when it comes to thinking about social connections and local level engagement in these kinds of processes. I'll leave it there. I hope that captures some of the question.
Great, thank you. So maybe a question that my own question, and it's again, it comes back a little bit to scales. But of course, watershed management is done at the watershed scale with the actors in that watershed. But of course, a lot of what happens in terms of land use and water usage in a watershed may not be driven by actors within the watershed, but actually by global drivers. And of course, climate change is one of them. But more to the point is that essentially, say, food production in one watershed may be driven by demands that are in a completely different part of the world. So you have these virtual water flows that we now talk about. And so those become more difficult because essentially actors within the watershed have no control, or little control, I would say, on some of these global drivers. And so that to me would mean that we need some form of international governance, which of course nowadays is a little bit under attack, maybe not a little, maybe a lot under attack by certain countries. So how do you see that be taken into account in, say, watershed management?
Well, I think you've really highlighted it at the international level. There are different forms of multilateral environmental agreements, agreements around sharing of water resources, and transboundary sharing of resources, looking at virtual, water footprints, virtual trade. All those areas have a contribution to make to what happens, how we think about what happens within the watershed. And I think informing those, keeping those processes in mind and informing that the global policy environment is very important. It's interesting. There's a dichotomy of views on that. How much are we worrying about what's happening at the global level when we're actually focused within the basin? I think it's important to make sure that what is done at the basin, and what's learned in terms of knowledge that is translated into these high-level policies. I do think also, where possible, just even an understanding of what the risks are of those kinds of, what are the implications in the basin context is important. So, for example, with climate change, understanding what that really means in terms of changes in the ecology of the system, the hydrology of the system, how it might influence people to move in and out of a basin, move to different places, and how to share the risk around that, and setting rules in place as to how to share risk and uncertainty is important. I think some of those rules will be really critical, because we can't necessarily manage all of these external drivers. But there's no doubt that I think more tension on the global policy agenda and these intergovernmental agreements is one way to start to deal with that, and to think about how that translates on the ground, and make sure that there is a two-way exchange of knowledge in that process. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but
yeah, I mean, sometimes it's important to just start a conversation. But what maybe about the idea to have something like, we have carbon trade, carbon pricing to deal with climate change. So maybe a water pricing or international water trade, some financial instruments that can basically motivate political actors to act.
Right. I mean, it's a lot. Obviously, I wouldn't go into. I'm not well placed to start a discussion on water pricing, the fors and against of some of these arguments. But there are some of these options. I think in the models for financing and the models for these kinds of instruments, especially economic instruments, those are coming under a lot of scrutiny right now, and I think we'll see quite a different set of instruments, or I hope so, in the future. When it comes to, there are some nice examples around water trade, big scale water trading, water banking, but there are often unintended consequences of some of these approaches. And in some places they simply don't work because socioculturally they just aren't appropriate. They're just not, conversations around monetary evaluation of ecosystem services in parts of Latin America. It's not a conversation that is appropriate to even have in some places. So there are some of these tools are just not going to work and just shouldn't be, even on the table probably. But certainly hybrid and blended models of finance in terms of how we think about valuing water, that's, an area of active discussion at the moment. And next year, the World Water Development Report will be around valuing water. And I think we'll be seeing some interesting, debate and interesting new approaches on that. But yeah, you raise an important point. And
yeah, I think that this, I wasn't expecting a final answer on this one.
That's good.
Out of a job, and maybe one last question, being since we're at the university here, because this is a natural question that would come up, is like, I mean, there's a lot of talk about interdisciplinary water research, watershed management, etc. What do you think in terms of kind of the next generation of students? What disciplines or what areas would be best to inform kind of the biocultural thinking that you showed us today?
Well, for me, I realized, I would preface this by saying, I realized I learned a great deal through my university education, but also through learning by doing on the ground. And I think that for the next generation of students, there was a lot I didn't know to read up about and learn, even if I didn't get it in my university classes. And I think this, firstly, just to say that I think there's a lot you can learn, while you're doing your university degree, even if it's not part of your coursework. But I think fundamentally the social sciences, if you're working in practical work in water and environment, grounding in areas of social sciences is essential. And in my education, that definitely wasn't the case. And I think, engineering, we now have ecological environmental engineering, that's part of the way, but I really think some fundamental training in areas such as in governance, management systems, political systems, even science diplomacy, there are whole new areas, disciplinary areas that are going to be very important. And I think we'll encourage new science that becomes transdisciplinary, but really also bridges more efficiently and more effectively the policy science divide and puts in a way that's pragmatic. So there are whole areas of science that are lacking. But I think for me, there's an enormous diversity encapsulated in the social sciences that is essential. Economics, yes, of course, that's an area I really don't have a background in, important, but I think areas of cultural anthropology as well, many others. So I think fundamentally education has to change at the postgraduate level, but beyond, even earlier, the youth in the younger generation, it's already changing. So much more questioning around issues that cross these divides. But I do think it's time for a very big change beyond, putting environmental in front of engineering. We're in a different world now, and sustainable development is another area that just has to be, I think, part of what students are taught. And if they don't, I think there's also be aware enough to know if you don't have those areas, you need to reach out and find people who can help you with them, because there's plenty of free online material. I just, was recently looking through courses that are supported by multiple universities that can help with that as well. So I think cross-university, cross-disciplinary, as the Water Institute is already doing there, that's my understanding. That's the way for the future I think. And we'll really hopefully transform the way we manage river systems.
Okay. Well, I think our time is up. So I would again like to thank you for essentially the talk, but also the engaging discussion we just had. And I also would like to thank all the participants for staying with us. And then certainly we'll see each other at the next WaterTalk.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks for the participation of students.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.